The year is 1957. The location is the edge of the known world, the frozen, desolate airspace above the Arctic Circle. This is the roof of the world, a place where compasses spin uselessly and the sun disappears for months at a time. For the crews of the Soviet Long-Range Aviation Command, this unforgiving white void is not just a frontier, it is the highway to war. Imagine the view from the cockpit of a Tupolev Tu-95 bomber. It is a massive beast of a machine, a silver giant powered by 4 roaring turboprop engines that shake the airframe with a bone-rattling vibration. Inside, the air is thin, smelling of ozone, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. The pilot, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, looks out into the pitch-black abyss. Below him is the pack ice, a jagged mosaic of white on black, stretching endlessly toward the North Pole. But his eyes are scanning the horizon, watching for the glimmer of a metallic reflection or the shadow of a wing against the stars. He knows he is not alone. For years, the Soviet strategy has been simple, brutal, and mathematically sound. They call it the bomber stream. The idea is to launch so many aircraft at once, hundreds of Tu-95 bombers and Myasishchev M4 aircraft, that the American defenses will be simply overwhelmed. It is a strategy of saturation. They believe that no matter how good the American radar is, no matter how fast their jets are, they cannot shoot down everyone. If 10 bombers die, 1 gets through. And in the nuclear age, 1 is enough to erase a city like New York or Chicago from the map. But on this particular patrol, deep in the winter of 1957, something changes. The radio operator in the Tu-95 stiffens. He presses his headset tighter against his ears, straining to hear through the static and the roar of the engines. He picks up a signal, a ground control intercept radar from the American side. It is the signature of the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, the Americans' newest, fastest interceptor. The Soviet crew knows this plane. They know its shape. A sharp, aggressive triangle cutting through the sky. They know its speed, but they also know its limitations. To shoot down a bomber, an interceptor usually needs to get behind it. It needs to lock on with a heat-seeking missile or use radar guidance to guide a warhead into the hot exhaust of the engines. This requires time, it requires precision, and most importantly, it requires the interceptor to fly a predictable path. The Soviet pilot tightens his grip on the yoke. He expects the American jet to swing around, to try and maneuver onto his tail. He is ready to counter. He has rear gunners. He has the altitude. But the American jet does not flank them. It does not try to get behind them. Instead, the radar shows the F-102 aircraft charging straight at them. It is a suicide run, a collision course. The distance closes rapidly, 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers. The Soviet crew watches in confusion. This defies every rule of aerial combat taught in the academies in Moscow. Why is the American flying a head-on intercept? At these closing speeds, a collision is almost guaranteed. Then, the sensors detect a launch. It is not a guided missile. There is no radar lock warning screaming in the Soviet cockpit. There is no tone indicating a heat seeker has acquired their engines. The American jet has simply fired a rocket. A dumb, unguided rocket. The Soviet pilot watches the smoke trail streak through the darkness. It looks primitive. It looks like a desperation move. A single unguided rocket fired into the vast emptiness of the sky against a formation of bombers moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The mathematics of such a shot are impossible. The odds of hitting a bomber with a dumb rocket in mid-air are 1 in a million. It is like trying to shoot a bullet out of the air with another bullet while blindfolded. The rocket streaks past them, missing the formation by a wide margin. It detonates harmlessly in the distance. The F-102 peels away, disappearing back into the dark. The Soviet crew is left in a state of profound bewilderment. They check their instruments. They check the damage. There is none. They are alive. The Americans missed. But as they turn back toward base, the confusion begins to fester into dread. The report they file when they land at their freezing airbase on the Kola Peninsula is not one of victory, but of deep, unsettling mystery. Why would the most technologically advanced nation on Earth, the United States, spend millions of dollars building a supersonic interceptor like the F-102, only to arm it with a weapon that appears to be useless? The intelligence officers in Moscow read the reports. They look at the telemetry. They see the pattern repeating. More encounters. More F-102 aircraft. More unguided rockets fired from impossible angles, often missing the target by hundreds of meters. It makes no sense. The Americans are obsessed with guidance systems, they are obsessed with computers. Yet here they are, throwing unguided spears into the sky. Is it a malfunction? Is the American guidance technology failing in the extreme cold of the Arctic? Or is this some kind of elaborate feint? The Soviet generals stare at the map of the North Pole. They see the flight paths of their bomber fleets. They have spent billions of rubles building these armadas, training thousands of men, constructing massive airfields on the permafrost. Their entire doctrine of nuclear deterrence relies on the certainty that the bomber stream can penetrate American airspace. But this strange behavior from the US Air Force introduces a variable they cannot calculate. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of the Cold War and the mysteries of military aviation, please take a moment to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories they didn't want you to know. Join our community and help us keep history alive. The stakes could not be higher. It is the height of the Cold War. Tensions are at a breaking point. The Hungarian Revolution has just been crushed by Soviet tanks. The Suez Crisis has shaken the world. Every radar blip, every unidentified shadow is treated as the start of World War III. In the Kremlin, the mood is tense. The Soviet leadership knows that the Americans are planning something. They have spies, they have listening posts, but there is a gap in their knowledge regarding the air defense of the North American continent. They know the Americans are terrified of the Soviet bomber fleet. They know the US is building a massive shield, the SAGE system, the DEW line of radars across Canada. But radars do not kill bombers, interceptors do. And if the primary American interceptor is armed with a weapon that cannot hit a target, then the Americans are vulnerable. This conclusion, however, feels like a trap. The Americans are arrogant, yes, but they are not stupid. They would not send their pilots into the Arctic night with useless weapons. There is something the Soviets are missing, a piece of the puzzle that is so terrifying, so outside the realm of conventional warfare, that their minds refuse to see it. The reports from the Arctic continue to trickle in throughout 1957 and 1958. The descriptions are consistent. F-102 aircraft flying aggressive, suicidal intercepts, launching rockets that do not guide, then turning away at maximum speed, as if fleeing the scene of a crime. This specific detail, the breakaway, begins to haunt the Soviet analysts. In standard combat, after firing a missile, a pilot usually waits to confirm the kill, or they engage the next target. But the American pilots are executing a maneuver that looks like panic. As soon as the rocket leaves the rail, they pull the aircraft into a violent high-G turn, engaging afterburners to put as much distance between themselves and the rocket as possible. Why run from a dud? Why run from a conventional explosion that, at best, would be a small puff of smoke in the vast sky? The fear begins to grow in the halls of the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. They start to wonder if the rocket is not meant to hit the plane. They wonder if the rocket is carrying something else. Chemical weapons? Biological agents that would freeze in the upper atmosphere? Or perhaps something that defies the very concept of air-to-air combat? The mystery deepens when Soviet radar stations in the Far East detect a massive spike in electromagnetic activity during an American training exercise. It is a pulse, brief but powerful, that washes over the sensors like a tidal wave. It is not a jammer. It is not a communication signal. It is the signature of a massive energy release. But there was no explosion seen, no flash of light visible from the ground. The Soviet scientists are baffled. They look at the data. They look at the behavior of the F-102 aircraft. They look at the primitive, unguided nature of the rockets. And they simply cannot connect the dots. The pieces are all there, staring them in the face, but the picture they form is too horrific to contemplate. To accept the truth would mean accepting that the Americans have crossed a line that no sane military would cross. It would mean that the sky above the Arctic is not just a battlefield, but a potential graveyard for physics itself. And so, the Soviet bomber crews continue to fly. They zip up their flight suits, climb into their freezing cockpits, and launch into the dark, trusting in their numbers. They trust that if they fly close enough together, their defensive guns will protect them. They trust that the American missiles will be confused by their countermeasures. They do not know that they are flying into a trap that has already been set, a trap that does not rely on accuracy, a trap that does not care about formation flying or electronic jamming. The mystery of the Phantom rocket becomes a ghost story among the Soviet air regiments, Pilots talk about it in hushed tones in the mess halls. They call it the Silver Lance, a weapon that misses but kills. "I saw it," one pilot might whisper over a glass of vodka. "It went right past us, kilometers away." And then, nothing. But the Americans ran. They ran like they had seen the devil. The uncertainty is a poison. It degrades morale. It forces the Soviet commanders to second-guess their attack plans. If the Americans have a weapon that they cannot understand, how can they plan a war? They order a massive intensification of intelligence gathering. They need answers. They need to know what is inside that rocket. They need to know why the F-102 pilots fly like they are escaping an execution. The order goes out from Moscow. Find the truth, whatever the cost. Because if they don't, the next time the bomber stream flies toward the North Pole, it might not just be a few planes that disappear. It might be the entire sky that catches fire. The debriefing room at the Olenya Air Base is a cold, sterile box of concrete. The only heat comes from a cast-iron radiator that clanks and hisses in the corner, smelling of rust. A single bulb hangs from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the face of the flight leader. He is exhausted. His eyes are rimmed with red, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the flight. Across the metal table sits a colonel from the GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate, and a technical specialist from the design bureaus in Moscow. The questions are repetitive. They are drilling for a detail that the pilot cannot provide. "Describe the launch again," the specialist demands, his pen hovering over a notepad. "The angle of attack. The distance." "I told you," the pilot snaps, his frustration boiling over. "He was head-on, maybe 4 kilometers out. He pulled up, fired, and then he ran. He turned so hard I thought he would rip his wings off. The rocket went wide. It passed us by 2 kilometers at least. It was a mistake, a panic fire." The GRU colonel leans forward. "Americans do not panic, comrade. Not like that, not every time." This scene plays out across the Soviet Union throughout 1958 and 1959. Every encounter with the F-102 aircraft is dissected. The flight data recorders are stripped and analyzed by the best minds in the Soviet aerospace industry. The radar tapes are played back in slow motion, over and over again, until the magnetic tape begins to wear thin. The data is impossible to reconcile with the laws of physics and warfare. The Soviet Union has spent a fortune stealing American secrets. They know about the Sidewinder missile, which tracks heat. They know about the Sparrow missile, which rides a radar beam. These are precision instruments. They are the scalpel. But the weapon the F-102 is firing, this phantom rocket, is a sledgehammer swung by a blind man. At the prestigious SAGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute near Moscow, a special committee is formed. Their task is to reverse engineer the American tactic. They build models. They run calculations on massive room-sized computers using punch cards. They call the project Operation Enigma. The scientists look at the trajectory of the American rocket. It is ballistic. Once it leaves the rail, it falls like a stone thrown by a child. There is no guidance, no fins moving to correct the path. In the age of supersonic jet combat, where engagement windows are measured in split seconds, an unguided rocket is an anachronism. It belongs in 1945, not 1958. One theory gains traction among the younger engineers, the electronic warfare theory. Perhaps, a young physicist suggests during a heated meeting, the rocket is not a weapon at all. Perhaps it is a delivery system for a high-intensity jammer. It flies into the middle of the formation and emits a pulse that blinds our bombing radars. It is a plausible theory. It explains why it doesn't need to hit a plane. It explains why the American pilot runs away to avoid jamming his own systems. The Soviets spend millions of rubles testing this hypothesis. They equip their bombers with shielded electronics. They change their radar frequencies, but the reports from the Arctic do not change. The F-102 aircraft keep firing, and they keep running. Another faction within the investigation pushes a darker theory, the biological hypothesis. The Cold War is a time of deep, paranoid fear regarding biological and chemical agents. The Soviets wonder if the Americans have developed a nerve gas that is effective at 40,000 feet, a cloud of death that the bombers would fly through. This terrified the aircrews. The idea of flying into an invisible cloud that would cause them to suffocate in their masks is far more terrifying than a missile impact. But this theory has holes. A gas cloud at that altitude, in the jet stream, would disperse in seconds. It is tactically useless. The investigation hits a wall. The Soviet military machine is rigid, hierarchical, and terrified of failure. No one wants to write a report to the Politburo saying, "We do not know what the Americans are doing." So, they fabricate complexities. They invent capabilities for the Americans that do not exist. They turn the F-102 into a mythical beast. Meanwhile, in the skies, the legend grows. Soviet pilots begin to give the American interceptor crews nicknames. They call them the Madmen. To fly a collision course at Mach 1 and fire a dumb rocket requires a level of aggression that borders on insanity. A report from a MiG-19 regiment stationed in East Germany adds fuel to the fire. They intercepted American radio chatter during a border patrol. They heard the American pilots using a code word when practicing this specific maneuver: music. Music on, the Americans would say, or big boom. The code words are meaningless without context, but they add to the mystique. Big boom implies an explosion, but the Soviet crews rarely see an explosion. They see the rocket disappear into the grey mist of the Arctic twilight. The KGB is ordered to step up its efforts. Agents in the United States are activated. They are told to look for anything related to the F-102 armament program. They comb through public aviation magazines, looking for slip-ups. They hang around bars near Air Force bases in California and Florida, listening to the drunken boasting of servicemen. They find fragments. They hear the name Douglas. They hear the designation MB-1. They hear whispers of a project called Ding Dong. The name Ding Dong sounds ridiculous to the serious Soviet generals. It sounds like a child's toy. They dismiss it as disinformation. Surely, the weapon that threatens the strategic security of the motherland would not be named after a doorbell. But one piece of intelligence freezes the blood of the analysts in Moscow. A spy in the Pentagon sends a microfilm photograph of a procurement document. It is a list of storage requirements for the MB-1 rocket. The requirements are not for standard munitions bunkers. They are for special weapons storage facilities. Special weapons. In the lexicon of the 1950s military, this phrase has only one meaning. It is the euphemism for the forbidden fire, the atom. The room in the Kremlin goes silent when this possibility is first raised. A nuclear air-to-air rocket? The idea is dismissed almost immediately by the senior marshals. It is madness, Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, the Minister of Defense, might have argued. To use a nuclear weapon to shoot down a plane? It is like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. The Americans are capitalists. They care about money. A nuclear warhead costs millions. A bomber costs millions. The exchange rate is poor. And the fallout? They would be nuking their own skies. They would blind their own radars with the EMP. No, it is impossible. The logic of the Soviet generals is sound. They project their own rational fears onto the enemy. They assume the Americans operate under the same constraints of logic and safety. They cannot conceive that the US Air Force, in its obsession with stopping the Soviet bomber stream, has decided that safety is a relative term. But the seed of doubt has been planted. The investigation shifts focus. They stop looking at the rocket as a kinetic weapon, something that hits, and start looking at it as an area denial weapon. If it is nuclear, how big is it? The scientists pull out their slide rules. They calculate the blast radius of a tactical nuclear warhead. 1 kiloton? 2 kilotons? If a 2-kiloton warhead detonates in the thin air of the stratosphere, the shockwave behaves differently than on the ground. It moves faster. The radiation spreads further. They simulate the scenario. A formation of 2 95 bombers flying in close formation for mutual defense. A single nuclear explosion occurs 2 kilometers away. The results of the simulation are catastrophic. The shockwave would not just damage the planes, it would snap their wings off. The heat pulse would melt the aluminum skin and blind the pilots instantly. The radiation would fry the electronics. A single rocket could wipe out an entire squadron. It explains the breakaway. A junior analyst whispers, staring at the chalkboard covered in equations. The American pilot. He is not running from a dud. He is running from the blast. He has to escape the thermal pulse of his own weapon. The realization is a cold hand gripping their hearts. The impossible miss was not a miss. It was a calculated distance. The Americans weren't trying to hit the bomber. They were trying to get the rocket close enough. But this is still just a theory. They have no proof. No radiation spikes have been detected because the Americans haven't detonated one in combat yet. They have only fired training rounds. The Soviet leadership is paralyzed by the implications. If the Americans have fielded nuclear air-to-air missiles, the entire Soviet doctrine of massed bomber attacks is obsolete. The bomber stream is no longer a spear, it is a target. A dense cluster of targets perfect for a single nuclear burst. They need to know for sure. They need to see the face of the beast. And so, the order comes down from the highest levels of the Kremlin: provoke them. They don't just want to fly patrols anymore. They want to push the Americans to the brink. They want to force an American pilot to arm his weapon, to lock on, to reveal the electronic signature of the warhead. It is a game of nuclear chicken played at 40,000 feet. Soviet pilots are ordered to fly deeper into American identification zones, to fly more aggressively, to ignore the warnings. Make them show their hand? The political officers tell the crews, do not fire, but do not turn back until you see the whites of their eyes. In the cockpits of the Tu-95 bombers, the crews cross themselves. They know they are being used as bait. They are the worms on the hook, dangling in the dark water, waiting for the shark to bite. The tension in the Arctic reaches a fever pitch. Every intercept is a potential flashpoint. The Soviet pilots watch the F-102 aircraft screaming toward them, wondering if today is the day the American pilot decides to flip the switch that turns the sky into a second Sunday. They are hunting for answers, but they are terrified of what they will find. They are chasing a ghost that, if caught, will kill them all. The investigation has led them to the door of the truth, but they are afraid to open it, because behind that door lies the absolute negation of their power. While the Soviets scramble in the dark, confused and fearful, on the other side of the world, in the bright sun of the Nevada desert and the sterile labs of California, the Americans are indeed building the very nightmare the Soviets fear. But the story of how they built it, and the sheer audacity of the engineering, is a tale of American ingenuity that rivals the Manhattan Project itself. The Soviets see the shadow. It is time to see the object casting it. While the Soviet generals in Moscow were chasing shadows and debating the existence of biological ghosts, the truth was sitting under the bright, relentless sun of Santa Monica, California. The answer to the mystery lay inside the hangars of the Douglas Aircraft Company and within the highly classified laboratories of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The Soviets were looking for a new guidance system. They were looking for a magic eye that could see through jamming. They were wrong. The Americans hadn't invented a better eye, they had invented a bigger hammer. To understand the weapon that terrified the Soviet Union, you have to understand the panic that gripped the United States Air Force in the mid-1950s. The Soviet bomber threat was evolving rapidly. The propeller-driven Tu-4 Bull, a reverse-engineered B-29, was being replaced by the jet-powered Tu-16 Badger and the terrifying turboprop giant, the Tu-95 Bear. The American defense strategists ran the numbers, and the math was grim. The standard American interceptor of the day was armed with machine guns or cannons, and perhaps a few early, unreliable guided missiles like the AIM-4 Falcon. The Falcon was a finicky piece of technology. It required the pilot to hold a steady radar lock. It could be confused by clouds, by ground clutter, or by the Sunday. In a simulation of a mass Soviet attack, the results were always the same. The bomber stream would get through. If the Soviets sent 100 bombers, the American interceptors might shoot down 20 or 30, but 70 would survive. And if those 70 carried nuclear weapons, the United States ceased to exist. The Air Force needed a weapon with a kill probability of 100%. They didn't want to damage the enemy, they wanted to erase them. The solution came from a radical, almost heretical idea. If you cannot guarantee a direct hit with a bullet or a missile, you stop trying to hit the plane. You hit the airspace itself. Enter the project code named Ding Dong. It was a name that sounded harmless, almost comical. But the engineering behind it was deadly serious. The concept was simple. Mount a nuclear warhead on a high-speed, unguided rocket. This was the birth of the Air-2 Genie. The Genie was an anomaly in the age of high-tech warfare. It had no guidance computer, it had no seeker head, it had no moving fins. It was in essence a 10-foot-long tube of solid rocket fuel with a nuclear device strapped to the front. It was the ultimate expression of brute force. But making it work required a level of American ingenuity that the Soviets, with their rigid top-down command structure, struggled to comprehend. The challenge was not the rocket. Rockets are simple. The challenge was the warhead. The scientists at Los Alamos were tasked with creating a nuclear device small enough to fit inside a standard air-to-air missile body, yet powerful enough to destroy a fleet of bombers. This was the W-25 warhead. It was a miracle of miniaturization. While early atomic bombs were the size of cars, the W-25 was a sphere roughly the size of a basketball. It packed a yield of 1.5 kilotons. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 1/10 the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It sounds small for a nuke, but in the air, it was devastating. The engineers calculated that the lethal radius of the blast against an aircraft was over 300 meters. That is 3 football fields in every direction. Any aircraft caught within that sphere would be instantly destroyed by the shock wave and thermal pulse. But the damage wouldn't stop there. The pressure wave would propagate for nearly a kilometer, snapping wings and crushing fuselages of any aircraft in the vicinity. This was the shotgun concept. The American pilot didn't need to be a sniper, he just needed to point his aircraft at the general formation of Soviet bombers and pull the trigger. But deploying this weapon required a new breed of aircraft and a new breed of courage. The Convair F-102 Delta Dagger was chosen as one of the primary carriers for this doomsday weapon. The F-102 was the first American supersonic interceptor designed with the area rule fuselage, the famous Coke bottle shape that allowed it to slip through the sound barrier. It was fast, sleek, and computerized. Integrating the Genie into the F-102 was a nightmare of engineering. The rocket was housed in an internal weapons bay to maintain the jet's aerodynamic profile. When the pilot pushed the fire button, the bay doors would snap open into the supersonic slipstream. The rocket would extend on a trapeze rail, ignite its massive solid-fuel motor, and scream away at Mach 3. The sheer speed of the rocket was critical. It had to clear the area before the warhead armed itself. This brings us to the most terrifying aspect of the project: the safety of the pilot. American engineers were not suicidal. They knew that firing a nuke from a fighter jet was inherently risky. So, they designed a complex, fail-safe arming mechanism that relied on the physical forces of flight. The Genie would not arm until the rocket motor had burned out and the weapon had traveled a safe distance. There were acceleration sensors, pressure switches, and timers all working in unison. If the rocket didn't accelerate fast enough, no boom. If it didn't fly far enough, no boom. But the pilot still had to survive the blast. This explains the panic turn the Soviet pilots witnessed. It wasn't fear, it was procedure. It was a carefully choreographed maneuver drilled into every F-102 pilot. The maneuver went like this. The pilot would accelerate to mark speeds on a head-on collision course. At the optimal range, usually about 6 miles out, the fire control computer would give the signal. The pilot would squeeze the trigger. Whoosh! The Genie leaves the rail. Immediately, the pilot is trained to execute a breakaway. He pulls the stick back and to the side, subjecting himself and the airframe to a crushing force of 4 or 5 Gs. He engages the afterburner, turning 180 degrees away from the target. He is running a race against his own weapon. The rocket travels for about 12 seconds. Then, a timer triggers the detonator. If the pilot has done his job, he is miles away, facing the opposite direction. He will feel a shove, the slap of the shockwave catching up to him, and the cockpit will light up with the reflection of 1,000 suns, even through the blackened visor of his helmet. Behind him, the sky is scrubbed clean. This was the secret the Soviets couldn't crack. They couldn't understand why the rocket was unguided, because they couldn't conceive that the Americans were using a warhead so powerful that guidance was irrelevant. The secrecy surrounding the Genie was absolute. The pilots were sworn to silence. The ground crews who loaded the special weapons worked under the watchful eyes of armed military police. The existence of the W-25 warhead was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. But inside the Pentagon, the pilots were young men, often in their early 20s. They sat in their ready rooms, playing cards, smoking cigarettes, waiting for the klaxon. They knew that if that alarm sounded for real, they would be sprinting to their jets, taxiing out, and launching into the sky to unleash the power of the atom. They carried a heavy burden. They knew that firing a Genie over Canadian or American soil meant detonating a nuclear weapon over their own people. The fallout would drift down on their own cities. But the alternative, letting a Soviet hydrogen bomb hit Chicago, was worse. It was a grim calculus. This technological leap, the combination of the supersonic F-102 and the nuclear Genie, gave the Americans a temporary but massive advantage. They had solved the bomber problem, but they needed to prove it. Simulations and math are one thing, reality is another. The generals needed to know if the rocket would actually work in the chaos of the upper atmosphere. They needed to know if a pilot could actually survive the blast. They needed a live fire test. And they needed the Soviets to know it too. They needed to send a message that couldn't be ignored. So, while the Soviet investigation in Part 2 was floundering in confusion, the Americans were preparing for the ultimate reveal. A demonstration of power so undeniable that it would force the Kremlin to rewrite their entire strategy. They planned an operation called Plum Bob John. It would be the only time in history a nuclear air-to-air rocket was fired and detonated with men standing directly underneath it. This was the moment the mystery would end and the shock would begin. The Americans were about to take the legend of the Phantom rocket and turn it into a blinding, undeniable reality. The stage was set in the Nevada desert, the cameras were rolling, the F-102 was fueled, and the Soviets, watching from their distant listening posts, were about to get the answer they had been dreading. The date is July 19th, 1957. The location is Yucca Flat, Nevada. The morning air is already baking hot, shimmering above the desert floor. But the focus of this day is not on the heat, it is on 5 men standing in the middle of the desolation. They are not prisoners. They are not test subjects in the traditional sense. They are officers of the United States Air Force. They stand shoulder to shoulder, wearing simple summer uniforms. No lead suits, no heavy protective gear, just sunglasses. One of them holds a handheld camera, another smokes a cigar. They look up into the cloudless blue sky, squinting against the glare. They are waiting for something that, by all rational logic, should kill them. High above them, at 19,000 feet, an F-89 Scorpion, the sister ship to the F-102, streaks across the sky. The pilot checks his instruments. He is carrying a live Air-2 Genie with a fully armed W-25 nuclear warhead. This is Operation Plum Bob, and the specific test is codenamed John. It is a publicity stunt of the highest order, designed with a dual purpose: to prove to the American public that using nuclear weapons for air defense is safe, and to prove to the Soviet Union that the United States is not bluffing. The countdown reaches 0. The pilot pulls the trigger, the rocket drops, the motor ignites, and the Genie races forward into the empty sky. It travels its designated distance, and then a new sun is born in the atmosphere. The flash is blinding, brighter than the desert noon. A fireball expands instantly, a sphere of roiling plasma that consumes a massive chunk of the sky. The sound comes seconds later, a thunderclap that shakes the ground beneath the 5 officers' feet. They do not run, they do not flinch. They stand their ground as the shockwave washes over them, kicking up dust around their boots. They look up at the mushroom cloud forming above their heads, the donut-shaped ring of smoke drifting in the wind. The message is sent, and it is heard loud and clear in Moscow. The footage of the John shot does not stay in a secret vault. It is released. It plays in newsreels. Photographs of the explosion are published in magazines. The Americans are flaunting it. For the Soviet intelligence analysts who had been agonizing over the Phantom rocket mystery, the realization hits with the force of a physical blow. The puzzle pieces slam into place, forming a picture of absolute horror. The unguided nature of the rocket. It wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. The breakaway maneuver? It wasn't panic, it was survival. The special weapons bunkers? They were exactly what the name implied. The report that lands on the desk of Premier Nikita Khrushchev is grim. It confirms that the American air defense network is no longer a conventional shield. It is a nuclear minefield. The shock moment for the Soviet military is profound. They realize that their entire strategic doctrine, the bomber stream, is dead. For years, the Soviets had trained their pilots to fly in tight combat boxes. The theory, borrowed from the Americans in World War II, was that massed firepower from defensive turrets could hold off interceptors. 100 bombers flying wingtip to wingtip could put up a wall of lead. But against the Genie, a tight formation is a suicide pact. The Soviet generals look at the kill radius data derived from their own nuclear tests. They realize that a single F-102 firing a single Genie rocket into the middle of a bomber formation would not just kill one plane, it would wipe out the entire squadron. The shockwave would propagate through the formation like a cue ball striking a rack of billiards. 1 rocket, 10 bombers destroyed. The math of the Cold War changes instantly. The Soviet Union has spent billions of rubles building thousands of bombers. They have trained armies of pilots. And with one technological leap, a dumb rocket with a nuclear fist, the Americans have rendered that investment almost worthless. The mood in the Kremlin shifts from confusion to anger, and then to a frantic, desperate scramble for a countermeasure. This leads to the futile response. The Soviets cannot shield their planes from a nuclear blast. You cannot add enough lead to an aircraft to stop gamma radiation without making it too heavy to fly. You cannot harden the aluminum skin against a thermal pulse that is hotter than the surface of the Sunday. So, they try to change the game. They begin to prioritize speed and altitude above all else. If they cannot survive the blast, they must outrun the interceptor. This desperation drives the development of the MiG-25 Foxbat. It is a monster of an aircraft, built around massive engines, designed to fly at Mach 3 and reach altitudes of 80,000 feet. The logic is simple. If we fly high enough and fast enough, the F-102 cannot catch us to fire the Genie. But this response, while technologically impressive, is strategically futile. The MiG-25 is a marvel of engineering, but it is a reaction to a specific threat that leaves the Soviets vulnerable in other ways. To achieve that speed, the MiG-25 sacrifices range. It sacrifices maneuverability. It becomes a specialized tool, a sprinter in a marathon. Furthermore, the Genie forces the Soviets to abandon the over-the-pole freefall bombing runs entirely. They realize they can never again fly directly over American soil to drop a bomb. The airspace is too toxic. They are forced to develop standoff weapons, massive, cumbersome cruise missiles like the KH-20, NATO reporting name Kangaroo. These are essentially pilotless drone aircraft strapped to the belly of a bomber. The idea is to launch them from thousands of kilometers away, outside the range of the F-102 and its nuclear rockets. But these missiles are huge. They create tremendous drag. A Tu-95 bomber carrying a Kangaroo missile is slow, sluggish, and burns fuel at an alarming rate. Its range is cut in half. The American dominance is absolute. The mere existence of the Genie has forced the Soviet Air Force to operate with one hand tied behind its back. They are forced to fly further out, carrying heavier loads, with less accuracy. The Soviet pilots, the men who actually have to fly these missions, feel the shift most acutely. The swagger of the early 1950s is gone. They know that if they are ordered to attack North America, they are not flying into a dogfight. They are flying into a nuclear furnace. They hear the stories of the John test. They know the Americans are willing to nuke their own sky to stop them. They are crazy, a Soviet general is rumored to have said during a strategy meeting in 1958. They will burn the sky to save the ground. The mystery is solved, but the terror remains. The impossible event from Part 1, the unguided rocket that missed, is now understood as a warning shot. The Americans weren't missing because they couldn't aim. They were missing because they didn't need to aim. The confrontation ends not with a bang, but with a strategic retreat. The massive armadas of Soviet bombers that once patrolled the edge of the Arctic ice begin to thin out. The aggressive probes into American airspace become more cautious. The F-102 pilots, sitting in their alert shacks in Alaska and Greenland, notice the change. The Bears, Tu-95s, don't come as close anymore. They turn back sooner. The Genie has done its job. It hasn't fired a shot in anger, but it has won the battle for the Arctic sky. But the legacy of this weapon goes beyond just tactics. It signals the terrifying peak of Cold War logic, the acceptance of limited nuclear war. And as the Soviets retreat to their drawing boards, licking their wounds, the world is left to reckon with the reality of what the Americans have built. They have created a weapon so powerful that it made accuracy obsolete. And in doing so, they have frozen the Soviet bomber fleet in its tracks. The verdict on the Air-2 Genie is best summarized by a single paradoxical statistic. Over 3,000 of these nuclear rockets were manufactured. They were deployed for nearly 30 years, carried by F-102 aircraft, F-101 Voodoos, and F-106 Delta Darts until 1985. And in all that time, the number of Genies fired in anger was exactly 0. This is the ultimate measure of the weapon's success. It was so effective, so terrifying in its implication, that it ended the conversation before it could begin. The Soviet Union never attempted a massed bomber penetration of North American airspace. The bomber stream that had kept American generals awake at night in the 1950s never materialized. The Genie did not need to kill a single Soviet pilot to win the war for the Arctic. It simply needed to exist. This technological checkmate exposes a deeper, more systemic failure within the Soviet Union, a macro theme that defined the latter half of the Cold War. It is the story of brute force versus innovation. The Soviet military economy was built on the concept of mass. They built thousands of tanks, thousands of bombers, and millions of artillery shells. It was an economy of scale, designed to overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers. When they saw the American threat, their instinct was always to build more or build bigger. When the threat of the F-102 and the Genie appeared, the Soviet response was the MiG-25 Foxbat. It was a magnificent machine, a triumph of raw power capable of flying at Mach 3. But it was also a crude instrument. It was built of heavy steel because the Soviets could not master the complex titanium manufacturing used by the Americans. Its engines were so powerful they would tear themselves apart if used at full speed for too long. The Soviets spent a fortune building a fleet of these super interceptors to counter a threat that the Americans had already solved with a simple, unguided rocket. The Americans, by contrast, leveraged their advantage in physics and miniaturization. The AR-2 Genie was relatively cheap. It was a dumb rocket with a smart warhead. It allowed the US Air Force to defend a massive continent with a relatively small force of interceptors. This economic asymmetry bled the Soviet Union dry. They were constantly forced to react to American innovations, the nuclear rocket, the stealth bomber, the cruise missile, by pouring billions of rubles into countermeasures that their crumbling economy could not sustain. The Genie forced them to redesign their entire strategic aviation doctrine, moving from cheap freefall bombs to expensive, complex cruise missiles. It was a slow, grinding defeat. The Phantom rocket of the 1950s was one of the first nails in the coffin of the Soviet superpower. It proved that in the nuclear age, you could not simply outproduce your enemy. You had to outthink them. The legacy of the Genie also changed the culture of the Cold War pilot. For the crews of the Air Defense Command, the interceptor mafia, the Genie became a badge of honor and a burden. They were the only pilots in history authorized to release a nuclear weapon on their own authority in the event of a communication breakdown. They carried the keys to the apocalypse in their pockets. But as the decades passed, the Genie faded into obscurity. The Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM, replaced the bomber as the primary threat. You cannot shoot down an ICBM with an unguided rocket. The game changed again. Yet, the Genie remained in the arsenal until the mid-1980s, a relic of a time when the Air Force believed it could fight a nuclear war in the sky and win. Today, the Arctic silence has returned. The great air bases at Thule, Greenland and Keflavik, Iceland are quiet shadows of what they once were. The alert hangars where F-102 aircraft once sat with nuclear rockets slung in their bellies are empty, their concrete floors cracked by the frost. The Soviet Tu-95 Bear bombers still fly, occasionally probing the edges of NATO airspace. But they are ghosts of a bygone era, intercepted now by modern jets carrying precision missiles that do not need to burn the sky to hit their mark. But if you listen closely to the wind howling over the polar ice caps, you can almost hear the echo of that era. A time when young men in silver jets were ready to turn the northern lights into a nuclear firestorm. The mystery of the Phantom rocket that baffled the Soviet High Command is a testament to the terrifying ingenuity of the Cold War. It serves as a reminder that the peace we enjoyed was not a natural state, but a fragile equilibrium held in place by weapons of unimaginable power. The Soviets were stunned not just because the Americans had a nuclear rocket, they were stunned because the Americans had the will to use it. They looked across the frozen roof of the world and saw a nation that was willing to draw a line in the sky with atomic fire. And in the face of that resolve, the bear turned back.